Are we good, Jerry? Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Martha Johnson, Director of the Maier Museum of Art at Randolph College. And I'd like to welcome you to the 31st Annual Helen Clark Berlin Symposium. We will begin this morning by acknowledging that the land Randolph College occupies was inhabited by Yesa, the people. But due to warfare, disease, forced migration, assimilation, and broken treaties, the people were reduced in number and were forced to a fraction of the land they once occupied. Today, descendants of the original people of the land, the Monacans, quote, understand that the land is the people and the people are the land, and we are not strangers on any of the land that was once considered our territory, unquote. They are not relics of the past, they live among us and we honor them. The Berlin Symposium is always held in conjunction with the college's annual exhibition of contemporary art. The first annual opened at the college in 1911. It's the longest running series of original exhibitions of contemporary art staged annually by an academic institution. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Mary Gray Shockey, class of 1969 and former trustee, who has generously supported every annual exhibition since the 100th, including this, the 111th annual exhibition, Survivance, Contemporary Native Art. On the occasion of the 80th annual exhibition, friends and family of Helen Clark Berlin, class of 1958, established a symposium in her honor, which would expand and extend the educational impact of the exhibition. This year's symposium is focused on Michael Namingha, one of 4 artists featured in Survivance. We are surrounded today by his work and the work of Cara Romero, Diego Romero, and Virgil Ortiz. It's been an honor to live with these objects for a few months. They have enriched all who enter here, and we are deeply grateful to Cara, Diego, Virgil, and Michael for their creativity and generosity in allowing us this opportunity. We are here for the second part of our 2-part symposium. Many of you were here this morning for Michael's presentation, and we are happy that you've returned for a deeper dive into his history, legacy, and themes embedded in his work. So this is a sort of an informal dialogue. I'll ask questions, and we'll have our conversation right here in front of you. And then after a while, we'll invite questions from you as well. First, I'd like to share some background to give you a glimpse of how this all came about. In early 2020, I attended the opening of Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists at the Renwick Gallery in Washington, D.C. This exhibition was organized by Jill Alberg-Yohe, Associate Curator of Native American Art at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and Terry Greaves, an independent curator and member of the Kiowa Nation. At the opening, both curators spoke. Dr. Yohe began by saying that she'd been taught in school that indigenous people essentially no longer existed. She said, "We were told that Native people had disappeared long ago, erased from the map of America. Like many non-natives of my generation, I was taught to believe that there had once been Native people, but they were now a part of distant history." I was struck by our similarity, both of us Scandinavian American women who had grown up around the same time, around the same Midwestern landscape. So many of them identified with indigenous names in the places that we lived and grew up in. This was my story too. I first encountered the word survivance in a statement written by Cara Romero, describing one of her projects. The term is attributed to White Earth Ojibwe scholar Gerald Visenor, and it suggests a narrative incorporating themes of survival and resistance that insists on the inclusion of the native presence. It is a concept that resists a single Eurocentric narrative of cultural extinction, of endings, as Dr. Yohe and I and our classmates were taught to believe. While our mission at the Maier is devoted to the study, collection, and exhibition of American art, none of our annuals have focused on Native artists, and only a handful are represented in our collection. 2022 marked the centennial of the annual Santa Fe Indian Market, widely considered the most recognized and influential events in the Native American art world of the 20th and 21st centuries. The history of the market is fraught, but paradoxically, it has also been empowering, community building, and undeniably important, especially in its current iteration 100 years later. Randolph's own Museum and Heritage Studies major, Emily Larkin Bryant, class of 1922, who's here. Raise your hand. I know you're here. There she is, over there. Yay. She engaged with the New Mexico History Museum in a virtual internship during the summer of 2021. Her task was to research the Santa Fe Indian Market and develop an interactive timeline to celebrate the market's centennial, which we invite you to experience in immersive and interactive formats in the adjacent gallery. Survivance features artists with roots in and connections to the Santa Fe Indian Market tradition and more generally in the creative output of the region. Their work is a blend of ancestral legacy, individual expression, and contemporary innovations. I'd like to thank Emily for planting the seeds of this exhibition and for co-curating it with me. Thank you, Emily. I'd also like to thank the Maier staff for coordinating all the details and putting the symposium together, particularly Laura McManus, our curator of education, and Kathleen Fort, administrative manager. Michael Namingha. Sorry about having to say all that. Anyway. Michael is a Tewa Hopi artist, and he studied at the Parsons School of Design and is in collections throughout the United States and abroad and comes from a long line of artists. And I thought that one of the things we were really interested in focusing on the Santa Fe Indian Market was how many artists had been involved in that for generations. And if we could start by talking about your legacy, the artists that came before you in your family line. We talked a little bit about that this morning, but there is so much more to be said about that. And so if you could kind of get us started by talking about some of those ancestors of yours.
Sure. Well, welcome back. Nice to see some of you again. So in my earlier presentation, I had talked about my family lineage, and my great-great-great-grandmother was a Hopi potter named Nampeo, and actually that's pretty funny. I'll come back to that later. This is one of her pieces, and this piece was done around 1906, and this is in my own collection, and it is of a doorway at Chaco Canyon, and I spoke about Chaco earlier today. But when I saw this piece, and I actually received this as a birthday present, the first thing I thought about was, holy moly, she was a true modernist abstract artist. Because I looked at it and I thought, I have no idea what that is. And I asked my dad and my brother, and so it was nice to have that family connection right there at the time to kind of go over her interpretation of the Chacoan landscape. And so Chaco has these very unique doorways. And so that's what this center area is here. And then these are representative of the landscape and the horizon. And my dad said that this is most likely in reference to a bird in flight. And so I received this piece, I guess, in October of 2022. So I had already done my work at Chaco, but it was just so interesting to me that she was looking at that same landscape 100 years before I was. And unknowingly, I had no idea that she had created this piece. And so I just felt this immediate connection to her. And this piece here is a jar that my grandmother, Dextra Quotzqueva, try saying that 5 times fast, did in 1980. And so Namingha was inspired by, she had visited an ancient site with an archaeologist near Hopi, and it's a place called Sikyatki. And she, with that archaeologist, were going through some pottery shards that were found at the site. And so she began to incorporate some of those pottery shards into her own design work. And so when I saw this piece by my grandmother, I thought about Namingha, and I thought about that connection, and I thought about this is basically my grandmother telling that same story. And there's another version of this pottery that's on the cover of a book that's much larger. This piece is no larger than a pen, like it's pretty small. So you can see the intricate design was pretty intense. So there is an exhibition right now in Santa Fe called Grounded in Clay, and it is a community-led curatorial project. So the School of Advanced Research in Santa Fe, along with the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, also in Santa Fe, and the Vilcek Foundation in New York City, invited some members of the Puebloan community in New Mexico to comb through the Vilcek Foundation, the School of Advanced Research collection of Puebloan pottery, and for each curator to select 1 or 2 pieces from those collections and to write an essay about it, about how they're connected to the work, what inspires them, if there's any sort of family connection. And so my brother is one of the curators, my father, I am, and so this was the piece that I chose for that exhibition. And when I was going through their storage of where they have all of these pottery pieces, I saw this piece. There was no label on it, but I knew it was my grandmother's, and I knew I had to write about it. And so I wrote an essay, and I can read it to you all if you'd like.
Yes, I asked if you would, because it's beautiful. Thank you.
So the essay is titled Saya, which means grandmother in Hopi, or Tewa. When I first encountered this piece, I knew it had to be my grandmother Dextra's pottery. I remember seeing a much larger version of it on the cover of a book. I was initially drawn to the painted fragments of pottery, which are pieced together like a very complicated collage. Each little painted shard tells a story through symbolism. It made me think of my great-great-great-grandmother, Namingha, who assembled fragments of Hopi pottery from the ancient village of Sikyatki to apply to her own pottery designs. To me, it seems that my grandmother is pictorially telling that story, but also telling the story of our culture. I have questions about this piece that I would like to ask my grandmother. Where did she get her clay from? What do these fragments represent? Which fragment did she paint first? Did she work in a particular direction? Alas, my grandmother passed away in 2019. I last saw her the summer before she passed, and she told us a story of the Tewa people that her mother had told her when she was a young girl. I used a recorder to document her storytelling, and I'm glad I did. I had planned to make a trip to see her and record some more stories, but I never made it. We forget about the impermanence of people. Storytelling and passing on these stories are so important. We need to take advantage of our relationships with our elders while they are here. In looking at this piece, I began to think of time spent with my grandmother when I was growing up. I remember a summer when we made pieces of pottery together. I was too young to realize how important that time was, our hands both tending to the clay and the scent of wet earth. I have a memory of her hands covered in that light coating of dried clay. Now, when I see my grandmother Dextra's work, I start to look for clues that may connect to my own artistic practice. So in preparing for that exhibition, they also asked some of the artists to create a page for a children's coloring book. And so I created this page using my grandmother's pottery piece. And there, you see Arizona highways here. And the reason why it's there is because when I used to go out to her studio on the Hopi Reservation, there was always an Arizona Highways magazine somewhere in the studio. And partly, I think because she was often written about in Arizona highways, as well as my father or some members of my family. And so I dated it November 1980 because the piece was dated 1980. But what I experienced when I was creating this coloring book page was sort of unintended. So I traced the patterns of my grandmother following her design pattern, and it was like having this experience of having her there physically because I was following in her footsteps, retracing these pottery shard designs up here. And so in a way, I was kind of answering my own questions about my essay. Following the pattern that she went, like which direction, because I ended up going clockwise when I was creating this, and I started here and I worked my way around. But I also realized just how complicated a pottery piece that is, because each one of those lines, it does take a while, even though I was simply copying it. So I don't know.
But you were also going through the same physical motions that she was.
Yeah, and I did this on an iPad, so I was using an Apple Pencil to follow her pattern, and whereas she was using a piece of yucca with some natural pigment earth to create her pattern. And this piece is also by my grandmother, Dextra. I just thought it was so funny. I came across it. It's part of the collection of the School of Advanced Research. And there is a ceramic artist that was a friend of my grandmother. His name is Rick Dillingham. He's since passed away. But in New Mexico, I don't know if they have them here too, but it's kind of a thing to do to have these vanity plates created for your cars with your name on it. And so he asked my grandmother, can you make me one of those vanity plates for me, not to put on my car, but just as a statement with Nampeo on it. I thought that was pretty funny.
So tell us about your participation in the Santa Fe Indian Market, and was Textra an exhibitor there? And I think you were telling me about last night about that you've not exhibited in that exhibition. But if you can just talk a little bit about that experience for you, because you did experience it.
Yeah, so growing up, my father exhibited in the Santa Fe Indian Market, I think once, in the 1970s. And he had gallery representation, and so he didn't think it was fair to have gallery representation at the same time as exhibiting at the Indian Market, because he wanted to have that opportunity given to another artist that maybe didn't have gallery representation and didn't have an exhibition in a commercial art space. And my family members, like my grandmother, a lot of my aunts and cousins are also potters and pottery makers. And so they exhibited every year in the Santa Fe Indian Market. And my parents, I grew up on the reservation of Okeo-Wingate in New Mexico, which is about 30 miles north of Santa Fe, until I was in the 4th grade. And then my parents moved to Santa Fe to get me a better education. And so my family moved off the reservation. We're living in Santa Fe. And so it was sort of the first time that my other family members had a place to stay that wasn't outside of Santa Fe. So I remember that first Indian Market when we had moved to Santa Fe, and we had all of these family members that descended on our house, and some of them were camping out in our backyard. But it was a very familiar atmosphere for me because I come from such a broad background of artists that it was always kind of just part of our family life, and to share those kinds of experiences. And so some of my family still exhibits during Indian Market. And so my parents opened their own art gallery in 1990. And it's located on Lincoln Avenue. And so the market runs along Lincoln, and a lot of those booths are set up on that space. And so when I started exhibiting at my parents' gallery, in a way I was participating in Indian Market, just not showing in the physical market itself, but having the gallery space and having my work here. Actually, a lot of the pieces that are hanging in this space today were part of exhibitions in August at our gallery.
The Emily's research, and I hope people will take some time to look at the timelines, but what she found was that during that, over the century of the market, a lot of variables that created the unique situations of any particular market were almost a reflection of the governmental policy towards indigenous peoples. And so it's a bit of a mirror on that. And I know that looking at the history, housing was a big issue. Where are the, people would come into Santa Fe, indigenous people would come into the city, and then where are they going to be? Where are they going to, pitch their tents? Where are they? And that was a big controversy, how that was handled, and sometimes often it was handled very poorly, but it was an issue over and over again. And I think it was interesting for you to talk about that, actually being there, and the idea of what is appropriate, what's acceptable, and that there was an openness to, of course, people are going to be staying in proximity to your home in tents, can you talk a little bit about that, about this perception of lodging and home, where's home and being at home and being welcoming, and that sort of thing about?
I think Native indigenous tribes, there is this sense of they're very welcoming a lot of times. I mean, I was telling Martha last night, if she were to go out to any Owinge or Hopi, and she could just say like, oh, I know blah, blah, blah. And they would welcome her into their homes and say, sit down, have a meal with us. And so I think with my family, when they built their house and we had all these relatives come out, and my father was having an exhibition around that same time, and so my mother was running the gallery and my dad was taking work to get installed at the gallery, and we had some family members that were cooking meals and making sure like everyone was getting into the mix and flow of things. So it's and the Indian market really only happens 2 days a year. It's that Friday and Saturday in August. And it's probably the largest market in Santa Fe in terms of numbers and the amount of tourists that come in. So that's another reason why I think some of the artists probably wouldn't have a place to stay, because so many tourists descend on Santa Fe at that time. And of course, hotels jack their prices up because they know they can. So it does become complicated. And I don't really know how artists have been dealing with that issue in recent years. Or where some of them are staying, because I think we haven't had family members staying with us for quite a few years.
I wanted to ask you about your role as an artist who's talking about current issues. Cara Romero is also interested in that, and that is, her work is full of these references. And she said in a recent talk, art has this amazing ability to disarm us and help bring us to difficult conversations and have critical dialogue in ways that they might not otherwise be able to do. And I've learned so much from this exhibition. The artists here, I didn't know about the 1680 Pueblo Revolt until I saw Virgil Ortiz's work over here. And Altered Landscapes, your Altered Landscapes has brought to my attention specific environmental impacts of the oil industry on sacred lands. What do you want the audience to know about that? And how do you think art kind of can work a message in ways that, headlines don't?
I think using headlines as a means for inspiration, because that a lot of times does happen with some of my work. When I'm doing research, I'll come across a story, a news story about something. And so that small blip will inspire something, or maybe the focus of the work or the direction of where it's going. And then by creating some of these works and using different colors, you're drawing the viewer in with something almost pleasant. But while you have them hooked, then you can give them that other story and the more serious side of what is happening. And sometimes when I do talk about these different bodies of work at different institutions or organizations, a lot of people don't realize that that's happening. Just like you said, you weren't aware of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, or I think it is sort of a call to action, but it's sort of my quiet way of bringing a call to action. And then I have some people come up to me saying, how can I get involved? Or who can I talk to about this? Or how can I make change?
And what do you say to them?
Sometimes locally in Santa Fe, I usually give some organizations that are doing a lot of research in this type of work. The Environmental Defense Fund is one of them. I used some of their information and scientific research when I was doing the Black Place series, but also some of my Altered Landscape series. They've been doing a lot of research in the Permian Basin, and they have this van that goes out and it records different methane gas emissions. And then they have satellite images, they have drones that they send up to take in some of these. And all of this information is available on their website. And if you kind of just Google Permian Basin EDF, it'll bring up all of their current mapping systems for it. So it's pretty interesting.
And how do you, wake up every morning and see, the new headline, and it's grim, and not feel like just turning away from it? How do you keep from, just saying, oh my God, forget it, I'm just gonna do something completely different?
Well, I don't wake up and read the news, that's first. And a lot of times, it's funny, during the pandemic, because we were so inside and indoors, and our only outlet was reading the news, and I literally finally had to give my time, allotted time during the week, only read the news at this hour, and it was never in the morning, and it was never before bed. It was somewhere in between. But I didn't want to stop reading the news because it's important. But I think that was a nice way to help curate how much I'm taking in and how I'm processing it. And when I'm working on different pieces, if I ever get stuck, I often will take a run outside for 3 or 4 miles, and that helps to open my train of thought. It's also kind of like a meditative space, but it's also usually in Santa Fe, and it's beautiful, and it's open sky, and it just helps to keep me grounded.
So you go outside, and you also regulate the message to yourself. Yeah, you start reading something and go, I like that, get up in the morning, don't start that way.
Yeah.
Start with coffee.
I think that's very important.
Yeah.
And I started reading a lot of Japanese writers during the pandemic. There's Murakami and Mishima. And I started to see kind of themes in their writing. And so I would look at where were these inspired from? Which led me to Tale of Genji, which was the first novel ever written. And so I think it's fun to get lost in your research. So you can find one thing, but then it can always lead to another train of thought.
Yeah, you've talked about an interest in Japanese culture, and a friend of mine just recently introduced me to the concept of wabi-sabi, and I had not known about it, and I just wonder, can you talk a little bit about that, about the Japanese, what is appealing to you about that?
Well, I love Japanese food first and foremost, and being landlocked in Santa Fe, it's not very easy to come by. But I was fortunate in 2008. I served as an arts commissioner for the city of Santa Fe for about 6 years. And they have a program with UNESCO for UNESCO's Creative Cities Network. And it's sort of like a sister cities program. So it's Santa Fe is known for folk art. So what are other cities within the UNESCO Creative Cities Network that are kind of driven by folk art or whatever? And so I was asked to be a delegate to represent the United States for a project in Nagoya, Japan. And it was a 2-week-long project, and there were different artists from around the world that were invited to participate, and we worked with Japanese university students, Japanese artists, Japanese storytellers, and we went around the city of Nagoya. We were broken up into different teams. I was jealous of the food team, but I was placed on the storytelling team. And that was a really interesting approach to a city, because usually you visit a city and you're like, okay, yeah, you check off all the places you're supposed to see. But this was a way to really go in deep with natives of that area and show us their true side of the city and tell us the history of it. Like I learned that Nagoya Castle was built, and during the building of Nagoya Castle, they created this river. So there's this river that runs through, I think it's called the Harakawa River, but it's a man-made river. So it really doesn't have a current. It just kind of, but it flows through the city. And so when we were there, the city had turned its back on it. And it's like a 450-year-old city, which, interestingly enough, was also the same age as Santa Fe. But they had turned their back on the city, and so they were starting to realize what they had. And so all of these businesses along the river had flipped themselves, and so now they were facing the river, and they were building these walkways where you could walk, and it was just an interesting time. But the project was to help the city of Nagoya come up with concepts with some of the local people about a more authentic souvenir, apart from seeing like a keychain or a t-shirt or a baseball cap. And so one of the teams, the food group that I was jealous of, came up with this atomizer. Nagoya is known for a very specific type of miso, and it has a certain scent and a certain flavor. It's kind of sweet. And so they came up with a way to package it into this scent-emitting atomizer. Is that how you say it? So when you spray it, you get that scent of the miso. Since scent triggers memory, they thought this was a way to take yourself back to Nagoya when you smell that scent. And I thought that was pretty cool.
Like the scent of your grandmother's, the
Hands
hands
yeah.
and the clay and all that.
Yeah, because some of these pieces, when we were going through selection of them for that exhibit, I noticed a lot of the curators, the first thing they did was pull the pot up to their nose and smell the interior, because it still smells like that earth and that scent of kind of wet earth, even though it's been dried for a long time. And that triggers so many things, so many emotions, so many memories.
I was just thinking about a conversation I was having with Kathleen Ford the other day about when it was almost going to snow here, and she said, because we're both from the north, where it snows a lot. And she goes, you remember now how we knew it was going to snow, right? And I said, yeah, because you could smell it.
Petrichor.
Right? Yeah. And then, of course, all the memories of those times in those storms come rushing back. I wanted to talk a little bit more about altered landscapes. And thinking about our conversation last week about them and touching on perspective and understanding. And you said a couple of things about that, that you're interested in something that seems really far away but is actually close. And when discussing Chaco Canyon, you alluded to silent toxic environments that you don't know you're in the middle of. And I understand that you're talking about environmental degradation, but of course, I extrapolated that into thinking about, what are we in the middle of that's toxic that we're not even aware of, and I also was remembering, as the story I told about growing up even though I was surrounded by all of these clues about indigenous peoples, just thinking, well, this was a distant past, and and what kind of toxic ideas we're in the middle of that we're not aware of. Is that something that you think about when you are thinking about distortion and skewed perspective and toxic environments that we're not realizing that we're in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a movie called A Single Man, yes. And it takes place in Los Angeles. And there's this scene where there's two characters in a parking lot, and they're watching this sunset, and it's this like beautiful pink sky. And it's that beautiful pink sky in Los Angeles because of the smog. And the line in the film is sometimes awful things have their own kind of beauty. And that line in that movie and that scene have always stuck with me. And so I thought about it often when I was creating some of these works. But sometimes it also didn't make sense because I wasn't quite sure how to fit it in, because we don't have smog in Santa Fe, but we do have fires. And so part of that inspiration came from the line in that movie about these environments that are sometimes beautiful, but there's this dark side to it.
Can you talk a little bit about what you're working on now, and using sand from
Yeah, so I'm
printmaking?
changing some of my photography to, I guess, a photo silkscreen process. And also, I thought about this after I created them. So I'm making all of these statements about oil and natural gas extraction, and yet I'm using petroleum-based product as the acrylic that they're face-mounted to. And then also I thought, well, how can I also make a connection to my family lineage, which are pottery makers? And so I worked last summer with a master printer up at the Anderson Ranch, creating photo silk screens of some of these pieces. But instead of the photo image being made up of ink, we would silk screen through an acrylic extender base and then apply sand to that and then shake off the sand, and what's left stuck to it will create the photo image. And so by using sand from the area where my family gathers earth for their clay works, I'll incorporate some of that same sand into my photographic works. So I can tie the two heritages, my photography and my clay-based artistic relatives together in one. But I also am looking at some of my great-great-great-grandmother's pottery designs and how I can incorporate those into some compositions that are still photo-based, but kind of using them as collage pieces. Like she was collecting shards, so I'm basically creating shards out of her pottery works and then using sand to make up those images. So that's my next project.
And the scale is going to be?
The scale is, that's the other great thing about silkscreen, is you can kind of scale as large as you would like. So I'm working on a commission piece right now for an unnamed institution that's going to be.
But it's kind of a big deal.
8 feet by 6 feet. Yeah. So it'll be fun.
This summer, maybe.
This summer, yeah. It'll be up hopefully by this summer.
One more question, and then we'll open it up to others. I wanted to thank our Curator of Education, Laura McManus, for this question. And in 2020, the National Gallery of Art acquired a painting by Jean Quick-to-See Smith, the artist over there, who's now 83, the first painting by a Native American artist that has entered their collection. Smith referred to the purchase as, quote, breaking the buckskin ceiling, unquote. And have you experienced institutional barriers? Do you think it's changing? As museums talk about decolonizing their collections and expanding community engagement, what do you want them to consider?
Yes, I think things are changing. I think there's a lot more change that needs to happen. I think also educating curators and directors and just people within the institutional sphere of how to deal with Native work, Native objects. Some are ceremonial and some are artworks, and where is that line drawn, and educating them on how to know how to identify those aspects. Being aware just also at the pace at which Native artists work, because I think it is in some ways different from other artists in my experience, and just kind of being cognizant of that. I think my generation is in a much better place than, say, my father's generation with museums. I think his generation opened the doors, and I feel like some members of my generation are kicking open those doors. And I think artists like Chinupa Onskaluger, Nicholas Galanine, Jean Quick-to-See Smith, Jeffrey Gibson, I mean, they're really making waves, and in such a great way. And it's really cool to see these artists in these institutions and these gallery spaces. Because I lived in New York for so long, and I would go to the Whitney, and I would go to MoMA, and I would go to the Met, or go to all these galleries in Chelsea, and I never, ever saw Native American representation. And today, it's like I can go to the MoMA, and I can see Kara's work. I mean, I took a photo of that because that was such a great experience to finally see that. And to see Jeffrey Gibson's work at the Whitney, or Tiani Whitehawk, Nicholas Galanine was in it. Chinupa did a great installation at the Museum of Art and Design in New York City. And then you're seeing them now at some of the major art fairs like Frieze or Art Basel. Rose Simpson is constantly at a lot of these shows, and her work is so amazing, and her story is also equally compelling. So I don't know, it's a good time right now, I think.
Yeah, Emily actually did her thesis on Rose Simpson, and we tried to get work on loan for this exhibition, but it was not possible to do. And Virgil Ortiz's work is really sought after as well, and we were so honored that he actually created this object for our show here. I am going to see if anyone has questions, and I'm going to come to you with the microphone, because if I don't do that, then no one will hear you on the live stream. So it's got to be, I think, Jennifer will go first, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you, Martha. I'm so excited that you put this slide up, because I am seeing a lot of really interesting visual connections between your great-great-grandmother's work and these, I mean, the angles, the planes, the kind of unfolding that it looks like is happening. So I just love the way that you are I don't know, subconsciously or intergenerationally channeling your great-great-grandmother. And I have a question to ask you about a motif that I feel like I see on this one and then your grandmother's. If you can tell me what it means. Is there something to the unfinished circle?
Right. That is a question I can't answer. Okay, but no, it's not that I can't answer it. It's that I don't want to inaccurately answer it. Yes.
I was going to ask about the ring also.
Oh. The closing of the ring.
Thank you for this lovely conversation. Speaking about sort of the changing or opening up, the breaking through the buckskin ceiling, as it's been described, and also thinking about how you opened describing Nampeyo's work as kind of abstract expressionist, right? I've been thinking about how much of how we talk about art is sort of in the language of the sort of Western, European categories, that gives an impression that there's this sort of progression or evolution that's almost necessary that goes, through different kinds of art. And I'm wondering, sort of first, how you think indigenous artwork fits in that scheme, and whether maybe it can offer an alternative to the way we think and talk about art per se. Those are big questions. So solve it for us.
Well, when I think about this piece and just referencing abstract and modernism, it was done in 1905. And so it was a time that someone like Kandinsky was painting on the opposite side of the world. But yet my great-great-great-grandmother was doing this on a reservation out at Hopi. And so it was like these parallels were there, but because we don't think of art, these were at some point useful vessels for the home, whereas Kandinsky's painting was paint on canvas for the wall. And I was at a panel recently at the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, and there was a speaker, he's the former governor of Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico. His name is Brian Bayo, and he was saying how there is no word for art in his language. And other representatives from other indigenous communities went around the room and said the same thing, that there is no word for art in their language. And that kind of set the tone for the rest of the two-day symposium. And I'm glad he said that. And it was such a heartwarming story. I don't want to retell the story because I don't want to it was his story, it wasn't my story, and I don't want to mess it up. But the way he told it, it was so beautiful, and it had to do with his relationship with his aunt, who was a potter. And he had asked her why she chose to be an artist, and that was her response. There is no word for art in our language. Yeah. Does that answer some of your question? Well, I was reading Tale of Genji recently. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's this interesting story about this young prince that lives in the royal court in Japan. And there's a part of the story where there's a painting contest. And I thought, oh, how interesting, a painting contest. And then I was switched to reading another book by Murakami. And he talks about that same painting contest, but he also talks about how Japanese painting before Western ideas was simply painting. And it wasn't until we were introduced to Picasso and European painters that it was categorized as Japanese painting. So it was kind of an interesting little tidbit I picked up.
Hi, thank you also for coming to speak with us today. I'm really interested in your pieces. Myself, I think using art as a form of environmental activism, especially in this particular time, is really important. And I was curious if there's any information about how this landscape was before it started being worked, and are these supposed to be a way of maybe like a forewarning of what will happen if we continue to abuse the land in such a way?
So the pieces behind you with the bright colors, those are from an extension of an exhibit I had at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. And so I was using Georgia O'Keeffe's painting of that same landscape sort of as my basis for this is what the landscape used to look like, and now this is what's happening to the landscape. And so the inclusion in that red piece there of the green pumping station with the other kind of pumping housing behind it also shows what kind of infrastructure is built around the area where O'Keeffe used to drive and camp with her friend Maria Chabot and paint that landscape. Because now it's just littered, and there's pumping jacks out there as well. And at one point there was a pipeline that went through it, and I think some of it's now underground. And then there's also flaring stations, but I think they outlawed flaring recently. So if you take a drive through there, you'll just see how vast of an area they've littered. And once you do that, you can't go back. I mean, there's no way to get that landscape back to what it used to be like. And I do like calling awareness through some of my work. And I think that was also part of my conversation with the Environmental Defense Fund, because they were also looking at ways that they could get their message across outside of what their work is usually, and their work is usually working with legislatures at a state level. And so they were saying, well, you're using our scientific data, like, is there a way that we could maybe collaborate at some point with like using your images to maybe reach a different audience?
Other questions? Whose hand was up over here?
Just a short, brief question, thank you. I believe I read this was also sacred land.
The area in the black place is close to Chaco.
Is that it?
It's about 20 miles, so it's pretty close. And there are roads that extend from Chaco, and archaeologists have studied them for years, but it was a sacred site, so a lot of pilgrimages were made to it or from it. And so they went through this area where the black place is.
Of course, I was thinking if it was sacred land, how in the world could they possibly build on anything like that? Right. And I realize if the Native Americans didn't make enough fuss about it, then of course they would have gone and done it anyway. Mm-hmm. But it still upset me. So, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Other questions?
Thank you so much for sharing about your ancestors and the artists that are part of your family. I was also wondering about your choice of photography, because your father and your Obviously you have potters in your family, and it seems like that's something that has been passed down as a medium. But you chose photography, and I'm assuming there was a particular reason. Did you also grow up taking photographs, or did?
So since my father is a painter and printmaker and musician and photographer, growing up we had access to his studio. And so when I was probably like 10 years old, I picked up one of his cameras and just started to use it, and one of his video cameras, and started to use it. And he finally was sort of like, yeah, I don't think you should use these anymore, so I'm going to give you your own camera. So he did. He bought me my own camera for one of my birthdays. And I've always loved Andy Warhol's work, and that was his tool. I don't know if he ever truly considered himself a photographer, just like I don't really truly consider myself a photographer either, but I use it as a tool to convey my message. Because a lot of times I don't get lost in like trying to set up that perfect Ansel Adams shot. I just want to have something that is a tool that is easily manipulable in software. And so since I use Photoshop a lot, and it can transfer to different types of work. So I can be doing these, but then I can also pivot to something like photo silkscreen or lithography. So that's, I guess, where it came from.
Other questions?
Hey, Kathy.
Thank you for letting us have your work here for the community and our students. I also think a lot about Japanese art. There's a book called In Praise of Shadows, and it talks about in Japan, there's the worn element, the kind of dark colors. Nothing is very bright.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also a curator at the Met who talked about looking at the Momoyama screens, that they seem very bright when they're under lights like this, but when they were made, it was candlelight.
Right.
It was lantern light.
Yeah.
So, in looking at your grandmother, your great grandmother's
Yes.
ceramic, and as you say, it must have been used in the household. It wasn't set aside. But there's something very soft, and I look into it when I look at it. There's an artist, Forrest Bess, who was from Texas, and they're abstract, but they're not abstract, so they lead you in a certain way. Or the artist Hilma af Klint.
Oh, yeah.
Also had more of Jungian symbolism. So when I look at that, it leads me in one way. When I look at yours, it leads me in another way, but it also throws me back out because of the color, the brightness, even the reflection. I could see the room as I'm looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there one way? You talked about photography, but do you go a lot of different ways into your work, or with Warhol, he also was a reflective artist in terms that he reflected the times. And
Yeah.
I just wondered if that seems a more private, intimate expression to me.
This does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Where this seems more in the world, reflecting the world, commenting on the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say my work is more like Warhol, reflective of what's happening and recording what's happening currently and showing what was at one point. It's like art has that opportunity to put a pinpoint on a time frame, and it'll just kind of hold there forever. It's like a placeholder. And we'll move on, and artists' work moves on from that point, and they're always constantly, I think, recording those sessions. And I think with like Warhol's work, he was recording a time and place. But I think so many artists are inspired by him because he wasn't just an artist either. He was a great marketer and. Mm-hmm.
Well, we invite you to stay and for our reception. We thank you, Michael, and
Thank you.
we will put the screen up, turn on the lights, so you can see the whole exhibition, and please enjoy Emily's timeline in the next gallery. And again, we are so grateful to be able to spend time with you, Michael,
Thank
today.
you.
And thank you for coming.